Caroline Reed thought buying an abandoned stone mansion for just $1 was the second chance she desperately needed. Nobody else bid. Nobody even tried. At first, she thought she'd gotten lucky. Then, 4 nights after moving in, Caroline woke at 2:17 a.m. to a sound beneath the floor. Knock! Knock! Knock. What she found underneath Blackwood Manor would uncover a secret buried for nearly 30 years and reveal why nobody in town had ever dared to buy that house. Stay with Caroline, because once she discovers what's knocking beneath that floor, there's no turning back. And if you believe some secrets are worth uncovering, subscribe and keep watching. Caroline Reed wasn't the kind of woman who expected life to give her anything. At 37, she had spent most of her life fixing pickup trucks and farm equipment in her father's small repair shop in eastern Tennessee. Grease beneath her fingernails felt more natural than jewelry, and she could often diagnose an engine simply by listening to it run. Her father, Thomas Reed, had taught her everything. Never force a broken part, he used to say. Find out why it failed. Caroline thought he was talking about engines. Then Thomas died unexpectedly. Only after the funeral did Caroline discover the repair shop was buried in debt. 6 months later, she watched strangers carry away 40 years of her father's tools. On her final morning there, Caroline walked into the empty garage carrying 2 cups of coffee out of habit. She placed one beside his workbench. Then she remembered there was nobody there to drink it. Of everything Thomas left behind, Caroline kept only his battered old wrench. Soon afterward, she packed her faded Ford pickup and left Tennessee, hoping to find somewhere that didn't remind her of everything she had lost. And that search brought her to Briar Glen, Kentucky. Just outside the quiet town stood Blackwood Manor, a massive stone mansion surrounded by 17 wooded acres. It had supposedly been abandoned for decades. The county auction started at just $1. Caroline raised her hand. Nobody else did. When the auctioneer called, "Sold," Caroline expected laughter or congratulations. Instead, the room went strangely quiet. As she headed for the door, an elderly man stopped her. "That house was never abandoned," he whispered. Caroline frowned. Then why didn't anyone buy it? The old man glanced nervously behind him. "The question isn't why nobody wanted Blackwood Manor." He leaned closer. "It's why somebody wanted you to have it." 3 days later, Caroline drove through the rusted gates of her new property. The mansion rose between the trees, dark and silent. But something immediately bothered her. For a house abandoned for decades, the driveway looked strangely clear. Caroline stared at it for a moment, then reached behind her seat and picked up her father's old wrench. She had spent her whole life finding out why broken things failed. Now she was about to discover what was broken inside Blackwood Manor. And on her 4th night there, at exactly 2:17 something beneath the floor would begin to knock. The first 3 nights at Blackwood Manor were quiet. Too quiet. Caroline had expected the usual sounds of an old house settling, pipes groaning, floorboards shifting, wind slipping through cracked window frames. Instead, the mansion seemed to swallow sound. Even her footsteps felt wrong inside those stone walls. On her first afternoon, Caroline began inspecting the property the way her father had taught her to inspect an unfamiliar engine. Slowly, one problem at a time, the plumbing still worked, which surprised her. More unsettling was a section of copper pipe beneath the kitchen sink. It was newer than everything around it. Someone had replaced it within the last few years. "Abandoned, Caroline muttered. Upstairs, she found something else. Dust covered most of the hallway, but near the north wing, Faint marks crossed the floor. Footprints. Not fresh enough to identify, but not 30 years old either. Caroline stared at them, remembering the old man's warning at the auction. That house was never abandoned. She told herself there had to be a reasonable explanation. County workers? Inspectors? Teenagers sneaking inside? Anything but what her imagination suggested. Then came the fourth night. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Caroline opened her eyes. For several seconds, she didn't know what had awakened her. Then she heard it. Knock. Caroline sat up. Silence. Knock. Her eyes moved toward the bedroom door. Then, knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not from the front door. Not from a window. They seemed to come from somewhere beneath the floor. Caroline reached for the flashlight beside her bed. She had spent 20 years around machines. She knew the difference between random noise and rhythm. That was a rhythm. And something about it made the hair rise along her arms. The next morning, she followed the sound toward the north wing. A large bookcase stood against the far wall. Caroline examined it closely. 4 screws held it in place. The screws were almost new. Her stomach tightened. Someone hadn't been trying to keep the bookcase from falling. They had been trying to keep someone from moving it. Caroline grabbed her tools. 20 minutes later, the bookcase pulled away from the wall. Behind it was a narrow doorway. Cold air touched her face. Inside was a small private study, untouched by the decay elsewhere in the mansion. Old books lined the walls. A heavy desk sat beneath a covered window. And in the center of the room lay a faded Persian rug. Caroline stepped onto it. The sound beneath her boot changed. Hollow. She froze, then slowly pulled the rug aside. A rectangular steel hatch was built into the floor. Its brass handle wasn't rusted. Caroline knelt beside it. For a moment, she thought about calling someone. Then she remembered something else her father used to say. If you want to know what's wrong, sooner or later you have to open it up. She wrapped her fingers around the handle and pulled. A breath of cold, dry air rose from below. Wooden steps disappeared into darkness. Caroline switched on her flashlight and descended. At the bottom, she expected a cellar. Instead, she found an archive. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls. Boxes were stacked neatly on shelves. Property maps, photographs, letters, and land deeds filled the room. Nothing looked forgotten. Caroline opened the nearest file. One family had supposedly sold the same farm twice. Another deed contained signatures that didn't match. Another property had been transferred after its owner was already dead. She opened another folder. Then another. The same pattern repeated across decades. Families losing farms. Records being altered. Land changing hands. Then Caroline found a document dated 1994. At the bottom was a familiar name. Walter Hargrove, Mayor of Briar Glen. Caroline's mouth went dry. She kept searching. Hargrove's name appeared again. And again. Then she noticed something that frightened her more than any forged deed. A folder near the cabinet had almost no dust on it. Someone had touched it recently. Caroline slowly looked around the underground room. The knocking suddenly made sense. Maybe the house hadn't been calling to her. Maybe someone had been down here. Then, creak. A floorboard moved somewhere above her. Caroline stopped breathing. Another creak. This one closer. She lifted her flashlight toward the open hatch. A shadow passed across the opening. Someone else was inside Blackwood Manor. Caroline didn't move. For several seconds. She stood in the underground archive with one hand wrapped around her flashlight and the other pressed against the cold metal cabinet beside her. Another floorboard creaked above. Slow. Deliberate. Someone was walking through Blackwood Manor. Caroline switched off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed her. She could hear her own heartbeat now. Then came footsteps. 1, 2, 3. They stopped directly above the hatch. Caroline tightened her grip on her father's old wrench. She had carried it downstairs without thinking. Now, for the first time in her life, she held it for something other than fixing a machine. The footsteps moved away. Caroline waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then she climbed. She raised the hatch slowly and slipped into the hidden study. Moonlight spilled through a gap in the curtains. The room appeared empty. Then a man's voice came from the hallway. "You should have left that door closed." "Miss Reed." Caroline froze. A tall man stepped into view. Mid-40s, gray suit, expensive shoes. He didn't look like a burglar. He looked like a man who believed he belonged there. "Who are you?" Caroline asked. The man glanced at the wrench in her hand. "Connor Hargrove." Caroline recognized the name immediately. Walter Hargrove's son. She had seen his photograph at the county office. 46 years old. Attorney. Property developer. A man whose family name seemed to be attached to half of Briar Glen. "How did you get into my house?" Connor almost smiled. "Your house." Caroline raised the wrench slightly. "I have a deed that says so." That wiped the smile from his face. Connor looked toward the open hatch. "How much have you read?" "Enough." Then you know those papers are more complicated than they look. They look like stolen land." Connor sighed. "You found a few old documents and suddenly you think you understand 30 years of history. Then explain it." He studied her for a moment. Then his voice softened. "My father made mistakes. So did other people. But those transactions are decades old. Families live on that land now. Businesses were built there. Retirement savings are tied to those properties." Caroline said nothing. "If you release those records," Connor continued, "you won't just hurt guilty men. You could destroy people who had nothing to do with what happened." For the first time, Caroline hesitated. Connor saw it and reached inside his jacket. Caroline gripped the wrench, but he only removed an envelope. He placed it on the desk. $750,000. Caroline stared at him. "For what?" "Blackwood Manor. Everything in it. You leave Kentucky tomorrow. $750,000. Enough to pay every debt. Enough to buy another garage. Enough to rebuild the life she'd lost after her father died." Connor stepped closer. "You bought this place for $1. Take the miracle." Caroline looked at the envelope. For one painful second, she imagined Thomas's shop reopening. The old sign above the door. The smell of coffee. Her father's workbench exactly where it belonged. Then she remembered carrying 2 cups into an empty garage. Money could buy another building. It couldn't bring him back. "No." Connor's expression changed. "You should think about that." "I just did." Silence settled between them. Then Connor looked toward the floor. "You believe truth automatically makes things better?" "Miss Reed." "I believe people deserve to know when something was stolen from them." "And what about the people living there now?" he asked. "People who bought those homes legally. What happens when your truth puts them on the street?" Caroline had no answer. Connor moved toward the door. Before leaving, he stopped. Truth has consequences, too. Outside, engines started. Caroline hurried to the window. 2 black SUVs sat beyond the iron gate. Men she had never seen before stood beside them. Connor walked toward the vehicles without looking back. Then Caroline noticed something. One of the men wasn't watching Connor. He was watching her. Caroline stepped away from the window. The mansion suddenly felt enormous around her. She had expected corruption to have an ugly face. Instead, Connor had given it an argument, and that frightened her almost as much as the men outside. Then she looked at the envelope on the desk. Beneath it was something she hadn't noticed before. A photograph. Caroline picked it up. It showed Blackwood Manor nearly 30 years earlier. 3 men stood on the front steps. Walter Hargrove was one of them. Caroline didn't recognize the second. But when she saw the third man, the wrench slipped from her hand and struck the floor. Because standing outside Blackwood Manor in that faded photograph was her father. Thomas Reed. Caroline stared at the photograph until the room seemed to tilt beneath her. Her father, Thomas Reed, standing on the front steps of Blackwood Manor nearly 30 years ago. She turned the photograph over. 3 names had been written across the back in faded blue ink. Walter Hargrove, Daniel Mercer, Thomas Reed. Caroline read them twice. Then a third time. Her father had never mentioned Briar Glen, never mentioned Blackwood Manor, and he certainly never mentioned Walter Hargrove. For the first time since arriving in Kentucky, Caroline felt something stronger than fear. She felt betrayed. Thomas had been the one person she trusted completely. What if the debts weren't the only thing he had hidden? What if her father had been part of this? Caroline spent the rest of the night searching the archive. Every time she found Thomas's name, her stomach tightened. But there was almost nothing. One photograph, a handwritten date, and a receipt from a repair shop in Tennessee. Her father's shop. By sunrise, Caroline knew she needed help. There was only one person she could think of. Samuel Brooks. Samuel was 67, a retired state police investigator who had known Thomas years earlier. Caroline remembered him stopping by the garage occasionally when she was young, usually for coffee more than car trouble. He lived nearly an hour away. When Caroline arrived, Samuel was repairing a fence behind his farmhouse. He smiled when he recognized her. The smile disappeared when she handed him the photograph. "Where did you get this?" "Blackwood Manor." Samuel went still. "You bought that place for $1. He looked at her as though she had just told him she'd stepped onto a frozen lake in April. Then Caroline told him everything. The basement, the deeds, Walter Hargrove, Connor's offer. When she finished, Samuel sat quietly at his kitchen table. Finally, Caroline pushed the photograph toward him. "Was my father involved?" Samuel looked at Thomas's face. "No." The answer came so quickly, Caroline almost didn't believe him. "How can you know that?" "Because I was investigating Hargrove back then." Samuel walked to a closet and pulled down an old cardboard box. Dust rose when he placed it on the table. "I haven't opened this in 28 years. Inside were maps, interview notes, copies of deeds, and photographs." Samuel removed one file. "Daniel Mercer. He owned farmland outside Briar Glen," Samuel said. "Found out deeds were being forged. Started collecting proof." "What happened to him?" "He disappeared before he could testify." Caroline looked toward the photograph. "And my father." Samuel took a long breath. "Daniel came through Tennessee while people were looking for him. His truck broke down near your father's shop." Caroline's chest tightened. "Dad fixed it." Samuel nodded. But that wasn't all. According to Samuel, 2 men arrived later asking questions. Thomas knew Daniel was frightened. He lied, told them he'd never seen him. Then Thomas gave Daniel his own truck and enough cash to get out of town. "Your father could have gotten himself hurt," Samuel said. "He did it anyway." Caroline looked down at her hands. All night she had feared discovering her father had been part of something terrible. Instead, she had discovered he had once risked himself for a stranger. Samuel reached deeper into the box. "But Caroline, There's something you need to understand. He spread several deeds across the table. The same names from Blackwood Manor appeared again and again. Hargrove, judges, county officials, developers. This wasn't one crooked mayor. Samuel said. It was a system. Caroline remembered Connor's words. What happens to the innocent families living there now? What if exposing it hurts people who had nothing to do with it? Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then don't confuse revenge with justice. That stayed with her. Maybe the goal wasn't to tear Briar Glen apart. Maybe it was to find out exactly what had happened and who was still responsible. Caroline began comparing Samuel's files with photographs she had taken in the basement. Then she saw it. A land transfer carrying Walter Hargrove's signature. She checked the date. Her breath caught. Samuel. He leaned closer. The document wasn't 30 years old. It wasn't 20. It had been signed 6 months ago. Caroline felt cold spread through her chest. Everything changed in that moment. This wasn't about digging up sins from the past. People were still being cheated. The machine was still running. Caroline touched the old wrench in her jacket pocket and heard her father's voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside her. Never force a broken part. Find out why it failed. She finally understood. She didn't need to destroy Briar Glen. She needed to find the broken part and stop it before another family lost everything. Caroline left Samuel's farmhouse with more than a box of old evidence. She left with a direction. For the first time since buying Blackwood Manor, she understood that exposing the truth wasn't enough. If she handled this carelessly, innocent families could be hurt alongside the people who had stolen from them. She needed someone who knew how to uncover corruption without burning down everything around it. Samuel gave her one name, Charlotte Hayes. Charlotte was 51, an investigative reporter based in Louisville. She had spent nearly 25 years following paper trails. Most people were afraid to touch public corruption, fraudulent charities, crooked officials. More importantly, Samuel trusted her. Caroline sent one short message. I have evidence of a land fraud operation in Briar Glen. Some records are 30 years old. One is 6 months old. I think people are still being hurt. Charlotte replied 11 minutes later. Don't email anything. Don't call local police. Meet me tomorrow. They met the following afternoon at a roadside diner nearly 70 miles from Briar Glen. Caroline brought photographs of the documents. Not the originals. Her father had taught her never to bring the only tool you had into a place you didn't know. Charlotte barely touched her coffee. For nearly an hour, she studied deed after deed. Finally, she looked up. This isn't a story about old corruption. I know. No, Charlotte said quietly. I don't think you do. She pointed to the recent transfer. If this is authentic, somebody has kept the same operation alive for decades. Caroline felt her stomach tighten. What do? We make sure the truth can survive without us. That evening, Charlotte scanned everything Caroline had brought. Copies went to 3 secure locations. Another set was prepared for an attorney outside the county. Then Charlotte gave Caroline instructions. Photograph every original. Write down every person who approached her. And above all, don't trust anyone just because they wear a badge. Caroline drove back to Blackwood Manor after dark. For once, there were no SUVs. No strange footsteps. Nothing waiting inside. The silence almost felt peaceful. Almost. The next morning, Caroline found a white envelope attached to the iron gate. No stamp. No name. Inside was a photograph. At first, she couldn't understand what she was looking at. Then her blood went cold. It was Caroline. Asleep on the sofa in Blackwood Manor. The picture had been taken the night before. From inside the room, she turned it over. 6 words had been written across the back. "Next time, we won't use a camera." Carolyn stood beside the gate for a long time. Then she went inside. She packed a duffel bag, clothes, cash, her documents. Finally, she picked up her father's wrench. Her hands were shaking. Maybe Connor had been right. Maybe there were battles ordinary people weren't supposed to fight. Carolyn carried everything to the truck and started the engine. All she had to do was drive. Back to Tennessee. Anywhere but here. She put the truck in reverse. Then she saw someone standing beyond the gate. An elderly man in a worn denim jacket. Caroline lowered the window. "Can I help you?" The man held up a folder. "My name's Henry Wallace. My father owned 86 acres south of town." Caroline said nothing. "Hargrove took it in 1989. His voice broke slightly. "My father spent the rest of his life telling people the deed was forged." Henry looked down. Nobody believed him. He held the folder toward Caroline. "He died thinking nobody ever would." Caroline turned off the engine. Henry wasn't the last. That afternoon, a 73-year-old widow arrived carrying letters her husband had hidden in a Bible. The next morning, a former courthouse clerk brought copies of records she'd been ordered to destroy decades earlier. "I was afraid," she whispered. Caroline understood. She had been afraid 10 minutes earlier. Maybe she still was. But fear looked different when you saw it reflected in someone else's eyes. By the end of the week, people Caroline had never met were standing on the porch of Blackwood Manor. Farmers, widows, retired workers, children who had grown old carrying their parents' unanswered questions. For decades, each of them had believed they were alone. Now they were beginning to understand they weren't. That evening, Caroline stood in the library surrounded by boxes of evidence. She picked up the photograph of herself sleeping. For the first time, she didn't see it as a warning. She saw desperation. Whoever had sent it was afraid too. Caroline carried the photograph to the fireplace and watched the flames curl around its edges. Then her phone rang. "Charlotte." Her voice sounded different. "Caroline, I found something in the auction records." "What?" A pause. "Blackwood Manor didn't accidentally go up for sale." Caroline stopped breathing. "Someone paid the back taxes 6 months before the auction. So they also requested that the opening bid be set at $1. Caroline looked toward the dark hallway. The old man's words returned to her. "Why somebody wanted you to have it?" "Who?" Caroline whispered. Charlotte was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Well, that's what you and I need to find out." For the next 2 days, Caroline barely slept. Not because she was afraid of Blackwood Manor anymore. Something inside her had changed. The photograph taken while she slept should have driven her out of Kentucky. The threats should have convinced her that Connor Hargrove and whoever stood behind him were too powerful to fight. Instead, Caroline kept thinking about the people who had come to her door. Henry Wallace, the widow clutching letters from her dead husband, the courthouse clerk who had carried her guilt for decades. They had all been afraid, and they had come anyway. Caroline finally understood something her father had known long before she did. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. Sometimes courage was simply deciding that something else mattered more. On Thursday morning, Charlotte arrived at Blackwood Manor carrying her laptop and a stack of county records. "I found the company that paid the back taxes," she said. Caroline leaned over the kitchen table. The company was called Mercer Holdings, LLC. It had existed for less than a year, completed only one transaction, and dissolved immediately afterward. "Mercer," Caroline whispered. She remembered the name on the photograph. Daniel Mercer, the man who had disappeared nearly 30 years earlier. That's impossible, Caroline said. Samuel thinks Mercer is dead. Samuel thinks Mercer disappeared, Charlotte corrected. That's not the same thing. They spent hours following addresses, tax records, and old corporate filings. Eventually, Charlotte found something. A mailing address in West Virginia, registered under the name David Miller, but an old signature attached to the account matched Daniel Mercer's handwriting. Caroline stared at the screen. He's alive. It took Samuel another day to confirm it. Daniel Mercer had never died. He had spent nearly 3 decades living under another name. And slowly, the truth came together. Daniel had been protecting Blackwood Manor from a distance. He had paid enough of its debts to prevent the property from being demolished. When the time was right, he quietly arranged for it to return to auction. For $1. But why me? Caroline asked. Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his old evidence box and removed a yellowed envelope. I think this belongs to you. Thomas Reed's name was written across the front. Caroline's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a short letter Daniel had written to her father in 1997. Thomas had never received it. Daniel thanked him for repairing his truck when he had no money, for lying to the men searching for him, for giving him another vehicle and enough cash to disappear. Then Caroline reached the final lines. You didn't know me, Tom. You had every reason to turn me away, but you believed me when nobody else would. Caroline stopped reading. For a moment, she was 37 years old and 7 years old at the same time, sitting on an overturned bucket in her father's garage, watching him work. She could almost smell the coffee, almost hear his voice. Samuel spoke softly. Daniel remembered. Caroline wiped her eyes. So he chose me because of Dad. Not exactly. Samuel pointed to another document. Daniel had followed Caroline's life from a distance after Thomas died. He knew she had lost the garage. He knew she was looking for a new start. And he knew one other thing. Thomas had once told him something about his daughter. That girl can't walk past something broken without trying to fix it. Caroline laughed through her tears. That sounds like him. Then Charlotte found the final piece. A maintenance payment made only 8 months earlier. Daniel hadn't merely arranged the auction. He had been inside Blackwood Manor. Recently, the replaced pipe, the clear driveway, the files without dust. Even the strange condition of the house suddenly made sense. Someone had been keeping the evidence alive until the right person opened the door. Caroline looked toward the floor. What about the knocking? Nobody answered. That mystery remained. But something else had become clear. Caroline had spent months believing her father's legacy disappeared when the repair shop was sold. She had been wrong. Thomas Reed had left behind something no auction could take. A choice. One decent thing done for a frightened stranger when there was nothing to gain from it. 30 years later, that choice had found its way back to his daughter. Caroline closed her eyes. Then she picked up her father's old wrench. For the first time since his funeral, holding it didn't make her feel like she'd lost him. It made her feel responsible for what he had taught her. We publish, she said. Charlotte studied her. You understand what happens after that? Caroline nodded. But we do it carefully. We protect the families who bought their homes honestly. We expose the people who built the scheme. Samuel smiled faintly. That sounds like your father. Caroline looked around Blackwood Manor. She had arrived here hoping to rebuild her own life. Now dozens of families were trusting her with pieces of theirs. And she finally knew what kind of woman she wanted to be. Not fearless. Not a hero. Just someone who wouldn't pass another generation's silence on to the next. Then Charlotte's phone rang. She answered. Within seconds, the color drained from her face. "What is it?" Caroline asked. Charlotte slowly lowered the phone. "One of the original files is missing." Caroline stared at her. "Which one?" "The Hargrove file." A cold silence filled the room. Charlotte swallowed. "And Caroline, Connor Hargrove disappeared this morning for 48 hours. Briar Glen seemed to hold its breath. Connor Hargrove was gone. So was the original file that could connect his family to nearly 30 years of stolen land. Samuel feared the worst. Charlotte feared Connor had taken the evidence to destroy it. But Caroline couldn't stop thinking about something Connor had said inside Blackwood Manor. Truth has consequences, too. At the time, she thought it was a threat. Now she wondered if it had been something else. A confession. Friday morning, Charlotte's investigation went public. The headline spread far beyond Briar Glen. Within hours, state investigators arrived. By afternoon, federal agents were carrying boxes from the county courthouse. Walter Hargrove stood outside town hall and called the accusations lies. By sunset, investigators had enough evidence to arrest him. People gathered along Main Street as the 74-year-old mayor was led away. Some cheered. Others simply watched. Caroline didn't celebrate. Too many people had already lost too much. Henry Wallace stood beside her, tears running down his weathered face. "My father should have seen this," he whispered. Caroline gently touched his arm. "Maybe this is how you make sure he wasn't forgotten." But the story wasn't over. 3 days later, a package arrived at Charlotte's office. Inside was the missing Hargrove file and a letter from Connor. For years, Connor had quietly collected evidence against his own father. He knew what Walter had done. He also knew innocent families now lived on land touched by the fraud. So Connor had done what frightened people often do: nothing. He protected his father publicly while secretly building a record of the truth. Until Caroline arrived. The missing file contained the final evidence investigators needed: bank transfers, forged deeds, and names no one had previously connected to the scheme. At the bottom of Connor's letter were 4 words: "I should have spoken sooner." 2 days later, Connor surrendered. Caroline never called him a hero. He wasn't one, but she understood something she hadn't understood when this began. People were rarely as simple as the stories told about them. Justice wasn't about finding monsters and destroying them. Sometimes it was about stopping ordinary people from continuing to make terrible choices out of fear. Over the following months, Briar Glen began the painful work of repairing what had been broken. Some families recovered property. Others received compensation. Investigators worked to protect homeowners who had purchased their land honestly, rather than punishing children and grandchildren for crimes committed before they ever arrived. And Blackwood Manor changed too. Caroline could have sold it. She received offers. She refused everyone. Instead, she repaired the roof, replaced broken windows, restored the stone steps. Samuel helped when his knees allowed it. Charlotte visited whenever she was nearby. And people who once avoided Blackwood Manor began walking through its front doors carrying photographs, deeds, letters, and stories. The underground archive that had hidden Briar Glen's secrets became the Blackwood Community Record Center. One afternoon, Caroline stood downstairs hanging something on the wall, her father's old wrench. Beneath it, she placed a small plaque. "Never force a broken part. Find out why it failed. Thomas Reed." Caroline stepped back. For years, she had believed losing the repair shop meant losing the last piece of her father. Now she understood. Thomas hadn't left her a building. He had left her an example. One quiet act of kindness toward Daniel Mercer had traveled through nearly 30 years of fear and silence before finding its way back to his daughter. Caroline wiped her eyes. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Henry Wallace stood in the doorway. He held an old photograph of his father standing beside the farm their family had lost. "We got it back," Henry said. Caroline looked at him. "The land." He nodded. His voice broke. 86 acres. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the old man began to cry. Caroline crossed the room and hugged him. And suddenly she was crying too. Not because every wrong had been repaired. Some never could be. Not because good people had won and bad people had lost. Life was more complicated than that. She cried because a man who had died believing nobody believed him finally had his name cleared. Because his son could go home. Because her own father, gone all these years, had somehow helped make it possible. That evening, Caroline sat alone on the stone steps of Blackwood Manor. The Kentucky hills turned gold beneath the setting sun. For once, the house behind her was full of voices. Not whispers, not secrets. Voices. Caroline smiled through her tears. She had bought Blackwood Manor for $1 because she thought she needed somewhere to begin again. Instead, it taught her something her father had understood all along. You don't always get to choose what the world leaves broken, but you do get to choose whether you walk past it. And sometimes, one quiet choice to do the right thing can keep traveling long after you're gone, until it reaches someone who needs the courage to make the next one. Thomas Reed never left Caroline a fortune. The repair shop was gone. Most of his tools were gone. For years. She believed all she had left was one battered wrench and a few memories. But Blackwood Manor taught her otherwise. Nearly 30 years earlier, Thomas had helped a frightened stranger simply because it was the right thing to do. He never knew that quiet act of kindness would survive him or one day find its way back to his daughter. Caroline finally understood. The wrench was only something she could hold. His real inheritance was the person he had taught her to become. And maybe that's what legacy really is. Not the house we leave behind. Not the money. Not the things with our names on them. But the kindness, courage, and values someone carries forward because of us. So think about the people whose voices you can still hear when life gets hard. And ask yourself one question. What will the people you love carry forward from you? Because sometimes, the smallest good deed we make today can keep changing lives long after we're gone. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments. What lesson did someone you love leave behind for you? And if you believe stories like Caroline's deserve to be remembered, subscribe and join us for the next one.